Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Free Press Book Club meeting for Andrew Stobo Sniderman and Douglas Sanderson's book, Valley of the Birdtail, An Indian Reserve, A White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll kick things off with a quick round of introductions. My name is Nadya Pankiw, and I am your book club administrator. We have Free Press Arts and Life editor Jill Wilson joining us as host. We have Adam Araujo from McNally Robinson and authors Andrew Stobo Sniderman and Douglas Sanderson. This stream is coming to you live from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 land and the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In a moment here, I'll pass it off to Adam for an introduction, and then Andrew and Douglas will take it away with a reading, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions, there is a live chat box to the bottom right of the video, and we will get to those when we can. After our discussion today, I will introduce our next pick, and with that, it's over to you, Adam.
Thank you. Here's the book in question, The Physical Object. I always like to show it from the bookstore. Valley of the Birdtail, An Indian Reserve, A White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation. Divided by a beautiful valley and 150 years of racism, the town of Rossburn and the Wew'suwet'en Indian Reserve have been neighbors nearly as long as Canada has been a country. Their story reflects much of what has gone wrong in relations between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous Canadians. It also offers, in the end, an uncommon measure of hope. Valley of the Birdtail is about two communities, about how two communities became separate and unequal and what it means for the rest of us. In Rossburn, once settled by Ukrainian immigrants who fled poverty and persecution, family income is near the national average, and more than a third of adults have graduated from university. In Wew'suwet'en, the average family lives below the national poverty line, and less than a third of adults have graduated from high school, with many haunted by their time in residential schools. This book follows multiple generations of two families, one white and one Indigenous, and weaves their lives into the larger story of Canada. It is a story of villains and heroes, irony and idealism, racism and reconciliation. Valley of the Birdtail has the ambition to change the way we think about our past and show a path to a better future. To the authors, Andrew Stobo Sniderman is a writer, lawyer, and Rhodes Scholar from Montreal. He has written for the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and Maclean's. He has also argued before the Supreme Court of Canada, served as the Human Rights Policy Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and worked for a judge of South Africa's Constitutional Court. Douglas Sanderson, Amo Benashi, is the Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and has served as a Senior Policy Advisor to Ontario's Attorney General and Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He is Swampy Cree, Beaver Clan of the Apaskwayak Cree Nation.
All right, we're going to lead it off with a reading.
Yeah, I think we'll start off with, we're going to hear from both authors, I think, and we're going to start off with Douglas.
Oh, sure. Just a second here. Get a view around my cat here. This is from towards the end of the volume, towards chapter 18. It's entitled A Grand Notion. The troubled relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians sometimes snaps into focus. A young Indigenous woman who was supposed to be in protective care is abandoned in a motel and then found dead after being raped and thrown from a bridge. A carload of Indigenous teens seeks help with a flat tire at a farmhouse, and one of them is shot dead by a farmer who assumes they have come to rob him. Hospital workers taunt an Indigenous woman as she draws her final breath. A patch of overgrown scrub yields up the bodies of hundreds of Indian children, long buried in unmarked graves, the horror of which had been whispered for decades. But it is never long before the news cycle turns and saves us the trouble of having to look away. Outrage blurs once more into indifference. It seems as though nothing has ever changed and nothing ever will. First Nations remain poor, the Indian Act is still valid legislation, and violence stains the Indigenous landscape. The reserve system has made interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous settler people less frequent than they otherwise might be. Poverty goes unseen. Violence happens elsewhere. And inequality is a lot easier to stomach when you're not the one losing out. We just don't regard one another as neighbors, but we are neighbors, just as Rossburn and Wew'suwikopo have been for more than a century. Yet these two communities show the remarkable extent to which neighbors can remain strangers. Only recently, after all these years of sharing the valley of the Birdtail, have they started to see each other differently and cooperate more. The change is limited, but it's a start. Perhaps the most basic challenge is that Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians talk past each other. When we think about our history, Indigenous and settler narratives rarely intersect. The bigger picture, that we are all bound together, entangled in unexpected and uncomfortable ways, is too often obscured. Clifford Sifton once said that the history of Canada is one of absorbing and romantic interest. By teaching Canadian history to Canada's students, he had hoped that the country would develop a sense of national unity, a Canadian soul, and a Canadian outlook from coast to coast. He hoped that students would be taught about the contributions immigrants made to the prairies. Quote, the epic story of Canadian pioneering with the high courage of those whose faith moved mountains properly told will thrill our children. And so it did. Millions of Canadians, such as Nelson Luhoy, grew up within the soothing confines of this heroic narrative. But so long as we allow ourselves to be trapped inside narrow stories about the past, reconciliation can never truly begin. Here in the present, the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians remains broken. The underfunding of reserve school is merely one symptom of a much deeper sickness, profound inequalities in education, health, and wealth outcomes. Listening to each other's stories is one way to stitch Canada back together. Reconciliation will require us, at the very least, to acknowledge one another's dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. So I'm gonna read a passage from a bit earlier in the book, starting on the bottom of page 141, the chapter that talks about Clifford Sifton, this monumentally important two-faced figure in Canadian history. Pushed by fear and pulled by hope, Ukrainians coming to Canada outnumbered the total number of American and British immigrants for the first time in 1899. Among these Ukrainian migrants were Troy Lahoy's great-great-grandparents, Maxim and Dorota Yasky. They took their 4 children, who were between the ages of 6 and 13, and left the Ukrainian province of Galicia to journey across the Atlantic to Canada. The trip took them a month. The train heading to Hamburg journeyed via the Austria border town Oswiecim, which later became infamous by its German name, Auschwitz. The fortunate travelers sat on narrow benches along the sides of rail cars. The rest perched crookedly on their bags in the aisles. At each stop, border agents, doctors, and merchants, along with plenty of scammers, did their best to extract whatever meager savings the travelers had stashed in their luggage and underwear. From Hamburg, the boat ride to Halifax on Canada's eastern shore took 2 weeks or so, depending on the whims of the ocean. The migrants stayed below water level in steerage, packed into bunk beds lining stuffy compartments. The seasick were plied with garlic and whiskey to calm stormy stomachs. The travelers whispered to one another about the Vilni Zemli, free land, that awaited them. Their boat, the coal-powered SS Phoenicia, carried 1,308 passengers. This ship was actually among the more comfortable vessels carrying migrants across the seas in those days because it was designed to transport humans. Often, immigrants traveled on cargo ships that had carried cattle, pigs, or grain from North America to Europe. The passengers of such ships arrived in their new country smelling like the animals that had preceded them. The Yaskus landed in Halifax on May 21st, 1899. The wooden dock was lined with sheds full to bursting with coal. After passing a medical screening, the family was ushered into a train where they sat on bare wooden boards. Bold letters inscribed on the train read, "Colonist cars." The words meant nothing to Maxim and Dorota, who didn't know a word of English. Thanks to Minister Sifton, there was no fare to pay. The train rumbled westward. To farmers from the Ukraine, the rough terrain of Western Ontario, with its never-ending parade of cliffs, rocks, and forests, hardly seemed like an agricultural paradise. A ripple of panic spread through the train. Perhaps they had been dreaming a lie after all. But once they reached the unrelenting flatness of Manitoba, their worst fears receded. Then, after 3,500 kilometers by rail, their train pulled into Winnipeg's Central Station.
Thank you very much for that. We're going to start off, I think, with some questions that were submitted by book club members. One of them, and this is actually asked by quite a few people, which I think it's a valid question. Are you aware of any other communities in Manitoba or Canada who have shared educational resources between First Nations communities and rural municipalities? If not, what are the hurdles, and what advice would you have for them?
So I'll maybe start and say quickly, no, we're not aware of any other communities sharing educational resources. And the reason for that is, well, it's actually the same reason that we could have a residential school system in the first place. And that's that in Canada, we have two separate education systems. The first is provincial, and so each province runs its own elementary and high schools and funds their universities. And that happens everywhere in the province except on Indian reserves, because Indians are a federal responsibility. And so the schools on reserve are actually funded out of a completely separate pile. It's a completely separate system than the provincial school system. They're not attached in any way. And so what's happened in Rossburn and Wayway is a really unique kind of partnership where it was, the players managed to convince the federal government that what it should do is it should provide funding that was equivalent to provincial funding for the reserve school, which increased their funding by about 35%. It's a really vast amount. And that enabled the reserve school to join forces with the surrounding school district. So they became essentially one big school district, and that made it possible for them to share resources, like a speech pathologist, for example. And it also had the effect of making it so that some classes actually take place on the reserve. So kids from Rossburn actually take a bus across to the reserve to attend some classes. And we think also it's the only place in Canada where this happens. And of course, the only reason why this happened in this one location is because it's just one school. And so the funding envelope was actually relatively small compared to the entire department budget. But once you start thinking about expanding that out across all of the reserve schools, the cost of the programs begin to skyrocket in a way that makes it cost prohibitive for any but the most generous governments.
Can I just add one point to that, Douglas? Thanks for that. That's perfectly clear. And I also want to say, yay for this book club. Thank you to the two most amazing institutions, the Winnipeg Free Press. I don't know where this book would be without you, Jill, and your colleagues. And to McNally Robinsons, you're the best. Adam and your colleagues are wonderful. And to all the people listening today, thank you for not watching the Winnipeg Jets game at the same time. And if you watch a recording of this, I forgive you for watching the Winnipeg Jets game. I just wanted to emphasize that, as Douglas was saying, this is a bit of a unique arrangement. And I think the power of this example is that it shows us how insane the normal system was. And so the government said, yeah, in this one case, we agree to equalize funding. And what that does is that shows us in a very naked way how unfairly all the other reserve schools across the country were being treated. And one of the reasons it's so insane is that many students on reserve schools end up going to a high school in the public system. And so it's good for everyone for schools on reserve to be successful. But for a long, long time, we've had these separate and unequal school systems that were not cooperating well, and it doesn't do any good to anyone.
I think we talk a lot at the end of this book about equality, and how that's the goal. How much of a hurdle do you think is the fact that for some people, instead of seeing additional resources being brought to Indigenous people as equality, they see it as, rather than being made whole, they see it as them getting extra resources?
Yeah, why don't you take that on, Stobo?
Yeah, I think, Jill, you've gotten right to kind of the heart of, I think it's the heart of what we're trying to do with this book, which is to listen to people who see a basic question like what equality means in a totally different way. So as you're saying, there's many among us who see an investment in Indigenous community as yet another, additional thing that Indigenous people are getting. And part of what we're trying to do the book is to listen very carefully to people who are saying that, to see where are you coming from. Let us try as respectfully and carefully as we can to listen to what you're saying so that we can see whether there's something to what you're saying, and maybe if you're on the wrong track, we can say why. And so I think there's a very important chapter in this book, I think it's 15, where we say, okay, here's all the conceptions that people have about reserves. A lot of it's about taxation. And this sense, Jill, you're right, that people on reserves are getting a really great deal. And we try to show why actually that's not really true. And I think what I'd like to point out is that a place like Prince Edward Island, or a territory like the Northwest Territories, every territory actually, the Yukon and Nunavut, they, like reserves, don't have the taxation capacity to fund decent schools. But nowhere do we ever hear, you know what, screw PEI. Let's let Yellowknife schools and Whitehorse schools be no good. It's kind of baked into our country that we see the value in having decent education in PEI in the territories. And somehow we've gotten to a place where there's this kind of black hole in our empathy and our political structure that allows these really bad schools to be present all across the country. And somehow that kind of slips through the cracks of our policy and our empathy. And this book is trying to work at that. And so I think at the end of the day, Douglas and I are trying to make an argument that, in fact, treating people to fair, providing decent schools is something that's good for all of us. And I think we can persuade you, if you read this book, that that is a fair way to look at it. But we want to bring the reader along with us and not start by saying, you know what, you people who don't think this at the outset, you're incorrigible people that we don't want to talk to. And that's not the attitude of this book.
I think you even hear people who don't have children saying they don't want to pay the school tax or education tax because I don't have kids going to that school. So what's it to me? Overlooking the fact that an educated populace is better for everyone, right?
Yeah, I just maybe want to add something here, which is that, each of us comes to look across the river at our neighbors, and we don't just appear in that moment, right? We approach that moment with this whole human history behind us, all the stuff that we've experienced, all the stuff that we've seen. And it is the case that Canada is, besides the Indigenous population, a country of immigrants. And that means that every class of immigrants has struggled hard and heartily. And in fact, in Valley of the Birdtail, a lot of the story is taken up with the story of Ukrainian immigration, of their settlement, of their struggle, of their overcoming racism and poverty and succeeding to become full citizens. But what that means is when they look across the river, right? They don't just see inequality. They see that inequality against the background of their own struggles. And that means that people look across the river and say, what's wrong with them? Why can't they succeed? We also had it really hard, but look what we've done. And that allows people to shift the blame for these circumstances to the people whom they're looking at across the river. And I think a great deal of the inequalities that we experience nowadays come from this lack of empathy that arises because we fail to situate that view across the river in its proper historical context, and instead just see it against the background of our own family experiences.
Absolutely. I think you were very, not, I want to say lucky, because that's not what it is, but the fact that you had these two communities that you were already doing a story on, and who also just happened to be from these two groups who could say that about each other, was very fortuitous from a structural standpoint, because that's exactly the issue that I think a lot of people have with viewing other people's struggles, is that they do say, I'm the grandchild of Jewish immigrants who certainly suffered a lot when they first came to Winnipeg. So why is my family succeeded? And I think having the Ukrainian community there, which is, historically people were extremely prejudiced against them, really worked to your advantage from a narrative standpoint. Was that something that you sort of discovered after you had initially done the magazine piece about the school district, that sort of presented itself to you as an idea for how to structure the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would put it is that it's a very deliberate choice of the place to tell this much larger story, which is trying to get at what Douglas was just talking about, which is we're trying to give the context for the inequality all around us so that we don't jump to easy conclusions. And I think, one of the things we've discovered while touring the country with this book is that, in fact, it's not that unique to have an Indigenous community right next to a municipality. It's actually quite common. And so that a lot of Canadians have experienced that. And a lot of Canadians have also experienced the feeling of being total strangers to your neighbors. I think that kind of resonates quite deeply. And the other thing that we've noticed is that, as you said, we're telling the story of Ukrainian Canadians, which is such an amazing, powerful story. And there are many Ukrainian Canadians, not just in Manitoba, but all across the country. But we've also discovered that immigrants of all kinds, from all around the world in this country, see themselves, when they read this book, in the story of Ukrainian immigrants for exactly the reason that Douglas described. And so people come and they do experience great hardship. And somehow, for reasons we try to explain in the book, they look at Indigenous people who are also suffering and they ask themselves, you know what, we figured it out over a couple of generations. Why not you? And Douglas and I are trying to explain that so that the conclusion doesn't end up being, we made it because of our best efforts and they're not because they're lazy. There's this very subtle work of policies year after year, and it's accumulating over generations that creates the world all around us.
What was the most surprising thing that you uncovered in your research?
So I will say that as a scholar, who works in this area, I did not discover any, any sort of exciting new facts. But I think that I, as a scholar and as an Indigenous person, learn about these issues the same way you do, which is that you sort of you hear one day about oh, there's this thing called residential schools, and here's this really terrible thing that happened, and you think, oh my God, that's so unjust, that's so terrible. And then maybe later you might hear that there was a pass system, that Indigenous people were trapped on their reserves. They were unable to leave without written permission for decades. And you think, oh my God, that's so unjust. That's so terrible. And then maybe you also hear that in the early days, the Indian agents did everything they could to prevent Indigenous people from succeeding at farming by making it impossible for them to acquire modern farm tools, by making it impossible for them to sell their products. And you think, oh my God, that's really terrible. And that's how I experienced them. But what I realized when we were researching and writing Valley and I had never appreciated before, was the way in which these policies are designed to work hand in glove, that they're not discrete injustices, right? Like you could create a residential school, go right ahead, but you're going to have parents there. They're going to be outside the gates. They're going to be wanting, they want to know what's going on with their kids. So you need a pass system, right? You need a way to keep the parents and the children separate, right? You need, and then eventually they're going to start suing. So you need to create a rule. You need to create a law that says, oh, actually Indians can't hire lawyers, right? I had heard about all of these injustices, but what I had not seen was the way in which they work together over time to create a continuing injustice rather than the series of one-off injustices.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Can I just add that, I was different in the sense that the facts were new to me. I was more of a blank slate as someone who grew up in urban Montreal, not knowing much. I think I was kind of the stand-in for most Canadians who were still very early in this learning. So a lot of it was shocking and new to me. But I think the most surprising and upsetting part of the research for me was stuff that comes up later in the book. I think it's in chapter 16, where we're kind of closer to the present day, because a lot of this story is in the past, but we're actually bringing us uncomfortably close to the present. And I decided to reach out to some former deputy ministers, the most senior bureaucrats in Ottawa in charge of, what was usually often called the Department of Indian Affairs. And these people are retired, but they all returned my emails. And I got on the phone with them and I asked very straightforward questions like, did you know that in the 80s and in the 90s and in the early 2000s, that schools on reserve, for example, were getting 40, 50% less funding than the provincial public school counterparts that were often just down the road? And the answer is yes. We all knew. It was obvious. It was glaringly obvious to all of us. And we just kept doing it because, the Canadian government had bigger priorities and the Canadian public either didn't notice or didn't care. It's actually a combination of the two. And so it just kind of kept rolling forward. So for me, the sickening realization was that a lot of this story that's bad is in the past and it happens before I was born, and I'm 40 years old. But a lot of it is actually during my lifetime. And so that was the kind of thing that got under my skin and maybe really motivated me the most, was seeing that actually a lot of this stuff is in the present. And so we have a lot of work to do now to keep rolling that back.
Yeah, I think you said in an interview that there's nothing accidental or inevitable about the way things are, which really struck me as being, a pretty damning statement about the system.
Yeah.
I also thought it was interesting that you say Maureen Tuvois, when she went to U of W, she studied residential schools, and that was sort of the first time that she had read anything or learned anything in depth about that system, despite the fact that her mother and father both attended residential school. I think most people think of settlers as being sort of ignorant of the residential school system, but it was interesting to find out that even people who have relatives who came from that system were not fully aware of what it was.
Well, let me actually take this on, Jill, because I see it a lot, yeah, with my Indigenous colleagues, especially the younger ones. And, someone will profess that ignorance, will say like, oh, I had no idea there were residential schools. And Indigenous people will be shocked and they'll be like, oh my God, how could you not know? But the truth is none of us knew. I mean, I found out the way most Indigenous people found out in the 90s. I was watching The National when Phil Fontaine was interviewed by Barbara Frum. Like literally no family in Canada ever talked about this. The shame was just so great. And how do you explain it? How do you sit down a kid and say what happened to you? Like, what are you going to say? How do you have them have faith in the world around them anymore when you have to tell them about these experiences? And so our families hid that truth from us. We should have been able to tell that something was seriously wrong. But we didn't, right? Like everything just seemed like, oh, this is how it is when you're an Indigenous child. This is what families are like. But increasingly the story is one that we expect people to know. And enough of us know now that it makes sense that we have that expectation. But I always try and remember that there was a moment in time when literally no one knew except for the people who had been there. And that bubble burst very slowly starting in the 1990s. But it wasn't until the decades after that that Indigenous people ourselves, and like I never spoke with my mother ever about her residential school experiences. I found out about them, but we never, to the day she died. And she's a proud, strong Indigenous woman, but I don't think she could bring herself to tell me. I don't think she could share with me. I don't think she could hurt me like that. Right. And I think that is the position of many Indigenous families, that they just literally don't know where you would even start to tell these stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The sorry, the narrative of your book is very it's like it's not what I was expecting. I think I've written about this, which you may have seen. I sort of felt like I was going to have to read this like it was medicine, like it was going to be good for me, and I should read it. And I put it off and put it off, and then once I picked it up, I read it in a day because it was just so compelling. Like it's just like it literally has mustache twirling villains in it, like in the form of the Indian agent. I mean, you couldn't craft someone more sort of cartoonishly evil.
Called hater. Called
Yes.
hater.
We cut out the part where he keeps going, "You must pay the rent."
I'm sort of just interested to know what the reactions you have got from readers about it have been, because it does. I think people's reaction is, "Oh, this is an important book. Important usually means boring." And it's just it's so not that. It's such a compelling story.
Yeah. Can I first of all just take a moment and thank Douglas for that unbelievably powerful answer you just gave. So thank you for that. And I also want to say that one thing we often hear in response to your question, Jill, is, people call it a novel, which I think is the highest compliment because it is a nonfiction story about real people. It's all true. But we've tried to, as much as we could, even though many of the people are not living and we could only talk to them through their letters and talking to people who know them, to recreate it in a narrative way. So precisely, it is not something that feels like homework. It is not something that's boring. And there are policies that we talk about, and we are trying to get at these big themes, but we're doing that in a very intimate way. And we're trying to do that, as you were saying, in the introduction, and Douglas was mentioning earlier, by getting into the lives of a family of non-Indigenous Canadians and a family of Indigenous Canadians. And the whole point of the structure is so that all of us, with at least some of the characters, we see pieces of ourselves in them. And we also wanted to pick characters, and Jill, you can tell us if that was true for you or not. But we also wanted people that surprised us, that were not just some predictable two-dimensional stereotype that we've already read enough about. And so the whole design of the story is to present people that will surprise and interest you. And the narrative of the story, I also don't think is that predictable. And there were 999 places in this country where we could have told the same story without the hopeful ending. There's so many places across this country where there's a poor Indigenous community and a thriving settler community, and things sucked 150 years ago and they still suck now. But we wanted a place where there was genuine beginnings of a different kind of relationship. And I just want to mention that moment you mentioned with Maureen, where she's reading about residential schools for the first time at university and confronting that. It's also the moment where she starts reading about the experience of Ukrainian Canadians. And it's the first time in her life is someone who grew up across the river from a community of Ukrainian Canadians, that Maureen starts to say, oh, there's actually a lot that we have in common. We had this past system that was creating prisons on reserves. And now I'm learning about the way that Ukrainian Canadians were interned during World War I in prison camps. And there was these barriers that just fell down in her mind. And I think that's an important part of the story. The fact that we're trying to convey that it's really a two-way street. So Douglas, I heard him say the other day, I'd never heard him say this, but apparently Douglas is going around saying, this book will change your life or your money back. Which is a pretty strong claim, but I love it. I love it. I think you're sincerely saying it, right, Douglas?
I am indeed. I've not had to pay anyone back yet.
I was going to say, I don't think he'll be writing any checks.
It's a sucker bet.
I'll stand behind you, Douglas. Yeah.
Thank you. I just maybe want to just add quickly that Stobo and I set out with a certain intentionality in crafting the book, and that's like we had read widely in the field, and I'm sure we all have, and it seems like, as an Indigenous person, I think that our authors and artists sometimes are at a loss to do anything more than to transfer to a reader that sense of pain and anguish and helplessness, which we Indigenous people often feel in thinking about these situations. And so our experience of reading those books has been, shame and depression and hopelessness. And that was not what we wanted to do. We wanted to set out to talk about a very difficult past, to talk about a very difficult present, but then also to talk about the ways in which we can imagine a brighter future and the ways in which we have many of the tools around us that what we need to have happen is to start having a conversation about how we're going to change things for the future. And I think that is the kind of finish to a book that leaves people with a sense that there is hope, that they don't have to wander around being completely depressed, that there is the possibility of change for the future. And that was the tone with which we wanted to leave the readers.
I think it's also interesting, not interesting. I mean, it's amazing that you actually show people changing, which I think doesn't happen often. People's minds don't change. They're set in their ways. And when you talk about Nelson in this book, who actually had a change of heart and became a different person. Is that hopeful to you? Is there hope that more people can have that change of heart?
Yeah, I actually think the most hopeful thing about Nelson isn't that he changed, although that's amazing. And we actually just saw Nelson just over the weekend. It was great to see him. To me, the most remarkable thing is when Nelson says, for all those years, I was a racist, and I probably still am, right? Like that sense of self-awareness that I found to be deeply, deeply moving. And I think that is the kind of reaction that we love to inspire in readers, is the sense that, we might be better, but we're still not really good. Right? There's always room for improvement.
Sure.
And I thought it was just genuinely incredibly human of Nelson to be able to see that in himself, that although he had changed, he's not done yet. And there's more change that he can't even see coming, but that he knows is part of his future.
Just from a more nuts and bolts standpoint, we do have a question from a book club member who admires the way you built the compelling narrative, woven the history, and issued a call to action. I can imagine this is a difficult enough process for one author to pull off, but I'm curious as to whether it was easier to manage with two, or did that make did the dynamic present its own challenges?
Yeah, I don't know if people can tell on this call, but I really love Douglas deeply, and I think we've also had a lot of fun together.
My wife calls Stobo my road husband because we spend so much time together now.
I'm honored. I could use a ring. I could use a ring, Douglas. But I want to say that it was necessary for us to do this together. I can't actually, at first, as people can see at the beginning of the book in the foreword, there was a moment where I thought, I'd written an article for Maclean's that was just me. And then as I plunged into the research of this book, I thought, you know what, I can do this. I'm a journalist. I'm a lawyer. I've represented Indigenous clients. I can just talk to people and put together this story. But the deeper and deeper I got into this story to really understand the structure that would make this work, the only way this story works is if we can really inhabit the worlds of an Indigenous community and a non-Indigenous community. And there was no way for just me to do that. It had to be a collaboration. And happily, I'd had this amazing teacher who'd become my friend, Douglas, and I had always been talking to him about this book. And I should also mention that, all the interviews were done before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, and then poor Douglas is stuck with me, and I'm stuck with Douglas with this book project to write. And we just broke up the book into chapters, and each one was a Google Doc. And those of you who don't know what that is, it's just a shared document where both people can make changes. And so this book, I think, it's every sentence has been rewritten at least 10 times. And the way it comes together is each of us going through pieces at a time and writing comments to each other and saying, hey, here's 5 versions of this sentence. What do you think? And the other one says, well, I think we could, I like that third one, but here's 3 versions of the second half of that sentence. And over time, what we're trying to do is to find a set of words that feels fair and true to both of us, even though we're very different. And to the extent this book sounds true to people from both of those places and to people from those types of places, which I think it does, if everything we've heard is true, it's because the two of us were listening and writing very carefully and deliberately together over years.
Yeah, I think that the fact that there's 2 of us makes the writing not more complicated, actually makes the writing better. Because there's no moment where it's just me like typing away and going, good, I'm done. And there's always, so every clause of every sentence has a second set of eyes. And so, there was a very early draft that said something like, Indian nations on land they once called their own, right? And I was like, whoa, well, I'm gonna rewrite that. And so after talking about it for like a couple hours, probably, we finally landed on a sentence that said, these indigenous nations on lands they once governed as their own, right? Which captures like not property, it's about governance, but like there's there's an intention that goes with every word in the book, and that's the kind of intention that you generate when you don't have a free hand to write anymore, when every word is going to be gone over by another person who's going to say, why that word, why not this word.
It's interesting also that you say at the beginning that the terms that you use sort of depended on terms that were used at the time, and that it was never easy to, it's easier than it sounds to choose the sensitive word. How much time went into that kind of editing?
Yeah, a lot, because you don't want to sanitize the words, but you also need to be sensitive to what it feels to people. So just to give one more example to complement what Douglas just said, there's the second chapter, which is about Linda, who's at residential school. It's a very tough chapter. And just doing the research for that chapter was awful because you're reading the archives of the Brandon residential school. I don't know how many people on this call have kind of driven down the road near Brandon, Grand Valley Road, and seen that old building that used to be on the hillside. And there's a lot of awful ways in which people running those schools talked about the students, and they would use the word, I'm not even going to say it out loud, although everyone here has probably heard it, but I'll spell it out, SAVAGE. Lots of that. And in an early draft, I use that word a lot, like 5, 6, 7 times in that chapter. And I remember there was an important moment where Douglas was like, I'm not saying you can't use that word, but that word pains me to read. And it was not hurting me in the same way, just because I wasn't connected to the history or the experience in the same way. And so what you end up having is one use of that word, I think, in that chapter. And I think that's a good example of how the two of us working together made it better, because it didn't sanitize that word. It just meant that we used it to its greatest effect once when it was necessary.
That's so I'm an editor for a newspaper, and we have a similar sort of policy. It's like you don't, if the quote has a swear in it or something, you don't use it unless it's something that explain, like we had a case where a woman punched another woman in the face and hurt her quite badly, and it was because she was called something vile. And we had a long debate over, do you use the word or not? Because it's something we would never print in the newspaper. But you had to, because you had to understand this, you had to understand what motivated this woman's reaction, right? And the words were so awful that it was like, without seeing them, you would be like, well, she overreacted. But you have to sometimes just see the one word, the word one time to know how hurtful it is, right? It's, yeah. Some questions, another question from the reader was sort of about the call to action and whether anyone from government has actually contacted you about your ideas for implementing this, the ideas in your final chapter.
So I think what I can say is that the book has circulated amongst a lot of government types, and at the sorts of levels where policy ideas get generated and acted upon. But we don't actually, we don't talk about it in any detail. But one of the issues, for example, is that what we propose is Indigenous nations would be a lot better off if they had a larger land base, right? That they could tax. So the problem there is that the provinces own all the land. It's all the Crown land is provincial. So while this is like an idea that the federal government might want to take up in some sense, they might think, oh, that's Sanderson and Sniderman, they're onto something. Without the cooperation of a provincial government, it's not going anywhere. And so it's just that there's a lot of pieces that have to fit together. And so that's what makes it unlikely that government is going to generate this as a solution on its own. And instead, what we're hoping is to get more people asking like what the plan is, like asking our political leaders, what's the plan? This is not the only way forward. The ideas that we have in the book, there are many, many other paths forward. But what we want to do is to generate a conversation about the future so that politicians see that it's in their interest to act in some way, to find those partnerships and seek them out. But I think I at least maybe have given up on the possibility that that government will initiate this change. I don't think that's how it usually happens. Those changes happen because citizens demand them and politicians listen. And I think that's what's going to have to happen here.
Yeah.
To that end, has the book been added to any curriculums in high school or universities that you know of?
Can I quickly just say I ran out the room because my poor son woke up and was crying. But to Douglas's point, the politicians will follow us. And for that reason, Jill, we are working as hard as we can to get this in high schools, because we think it's absolutely appropriate for grade 10, 11, and 12. And if anyone listening has any suggestions about how we do it, we're doing our best, but we're open to any suggestions. But that is our goal, because ultimately those those students are going to become the people who demand the changes that we need.
Yeah,
Sure.
let me just also add really quickly here that in doing the tour and talking to people, we've really been very pleasantly surprised with the manner, the lust with which people want to get in on the reconciliation thing, right? Like people are really eager to do it. They want ideas. They want to know how they can do it. And I guess like sort of about halfway through the tour, we sort of realized like, everyone's on about the reconciliation, but that truth part, right? Like lots of people didn't go there. And so I think Valley of the Birdtail actually provides that background of truth that allows us to think about the future. And I think that the kinds of solutions that address the political and economic problems only makes sense when you see the whole historical arc. If you just talk about those changes in the present day, I think people are like, well, why would we do that? I'm not sure. It's and so that truth piece, the truth of the Truth and Reconciliation Report is really, really critical. And I think a lot of people were like, residential schools, that's really terrible. I guess I know enough now. And what we hope to show with Valley is that as terrible and as impactful as residential schools were, they're just literally just one of a series of injustices. Without seeing that whole history, the solutions about going forward don't make as much sense as they otherwise would.
Definitely. Adam, did you have any questions?
I mean, definitely, you having the book as an educational resource. Of course, some of our viewers asked that as well. Yeah, was interested more in that. You said you've made a few inroads in high school, and that is there a specific route? Are you just sending books out to superintendents? Is there is like
well, so Adam, it's Canada's a really big country and it's organized in an odd way. And one of the ways it's organized is that provinces control education. And so that means each province is in control of its own education departments and budgets. And then within each province, school districts can. So what we've discovered is that there's no like one person you can call. There's no one position in each school district or a province. So it's been for us this process of just like trying to talk to anybody who can talk to anyone who buys books for schools. And that is a fairly inefficient way of going about this, but it's the road we have available to us, and it's what we're doing.
You would be amazed how many books I have bought to give to people. So they're being mailed all across the country to this. And so we're always open to suggestions, but we really think that's the one of the key audiences for us is young people who can read a book that was just not available for me at that age that I think would have just changed the way I approach these problems totally. And we definitely wanted to be in there.
Great.
Although I should say, if I may quickly say that the most amazing, we hear stories about teenagers giving the book to their parents who hand it up to their grandparents and grandparents who are handing the book to their grandchildren. And I just love that. And there's a power to that. And there's this dialogue that I think is happening within families that this book is creating that perhaps speaks to the fact that it's capable of reaching different kinds of people, and that's really its power.
I'd say in the last point is in the store, I definitely see that. Obviously, we have the book here daily. People are asking for it. It's people of all ages bringing it, sharing with each other and stuff. So very anecdotally in my daily life, I see people engaging with it from all walks of life. So
that's really wonderful.
I feel good about your chances. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam.
Well, I see Nadya is here giving us the signal to wrap it up. Thank you guys so
I want to
much.
keep going.
It's the smiling face that says wrap it.
I'll just throw it back to Andrew or Douglas. Do you have any final thoughts, final words that you want to share with our viewers before I conclude the discussion?
Yeah, I will just say, as I often do at the end of these things, that we really very much enjoy doing these events, and we enjoy talking to readers. And so, if anyone out there has other questions or comments that they'd like to provide to us, we're really easy to find on the internet, and we love hearing from you. So please just reach out and let us know what you think, or ask whatever it is you want to know. We're very happy to engage.
Amen. And I'm thrilled to have had the chance to have a conversation with all of you today.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. This was such an engaging, compelling discussion to watch. Thank you both and all of you for being here with us. Next month, we will be welcoming author Wabgeshig Rice for Moon of the Turning Leaves. If you were with us in book club, I think it was our Moon of the Crusted Snow was our pick for December 2021 and January 2022. So this is the sequel to that. And if you want to start from the top, we have that discussion still up on our YouTube channel. Our meeting for Moon of the Turning Leaves will take place right here on our YouTube channel on Tuesday, April 30th. And we appreciate everyone who has tuned in with us tonight. And thank you so much for reading along. We will be seeing you next month.